Okay, so today's class, like I said, it's about edible landscaping, growing in the ground in containers, and using raised beds. Today's webinar is on Zoom. Please, if you have any questions, please answer them in the Q or put them in the Q&A button, and we will go over them at the very end. Santa Clarita Valley Water, who are we? We are a full-service regional water agency located in the Santa Clarita Valley. Lately in the news, you may have seen that we are in a drought, and drought conditions have not gotten any better. So we ask you to do your part and conserve water as best as you can. Together we can save 15%. And one way to save water is you can apply for our rebate programs. Those are really great. You can go to conserve.yourscvwater.com. Some resources we have when you go out there to purchase plants and stuff is our hottest plant guide. It's on our website. Go ahead and take a look at that and see some plants you may like. And when you go to the nursery, you have your list already and ask if they have them in stock. Another great tool or resource for you is the Water Smart Workshop. If you haven't already done it, I highly encourage you to do it. It's $20, and then you get to check to see if you have leaks in your home. And then we have the irrigation controller rebate. It's a great rebate. It's $150, and it helps you save water, and so in addition, you save money. We do have our new and improved landscape replacement program. Super popular program. We highly recommend it. You can earn up to $3 per square foot, and there's additional incentives included in it now. So please visit our website if you're interested in removing your lawn. We also have the help program so you can upgrade your irrigation hardware. So if you're in the process of removing your landscape and you're going to be planting some new plants, there are some great high efficiency nozzles and other things you can use and get money for it. So yeah, we will be on Zoom till the end of this year. Hopefully next year we can come back in person with a few classes. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all our classes are posted on YouTube. May's gardening class will be on May 14th, and we will be going over irrigation basics for a sustainable landscape. So take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Laura. Are you going to switch over to my screen or allow me?
Yes. So you can go ahead and start sharing your screen.
It's not, there we go. Now we got it. Took a moment. Let me just get things going here, folks. Just a moment here. Close down. And I think we're ready to go. So welcome everybody to, water-wise vegetable gardening. You know, we're talking about ways to incorporate edibles into your landscape, but also to do it in a very efficient way. So let's go ahead and get things going here. My name is Steve Williams. I've been teaching these classes in Santa Clarita for many years, and in person and virtually. I teach classes at Mount San Antonio College in Walnut, where I have a 15-bed raised bed garden, which is largely edible. We do have beds with natives and a butterfly garden, blueberry bed, but the students that I have are senior citizens, and they tend to their garden space and harvest and eat their rewards. So today we're looking at ways that you can incorporate edibles into your landscape, and you'll see some beautiful pictures here along the way. Let's give you some basics. One of the things that we want to consider is whether it be edibles or ornamentals, planting plants in groups that have similar water needs. So if we're speaking of incorporating edibles into our ornamental landscape, we want to plant those plants, edibles with our ornamentals that have similar water needs, and it's very important. Also, we want to look at making sure that their soil requirements are similar with soil drainage, that their sun and shade requirements are similar. And then, of course, temperature is an important thing. And we all know that summers get very hot where you're at, and sometimes it's hard to find that shady spot, but we'll talk about ways to deal with that. So think of in your garden that you want to plant plants where they have a minimum of 6 hours of sunlight, particularly for those edibles. And full sun, and now you have some things that maybe can get by with less, but in most cases, edibles really want 6 hours or more of sunlight. And because our sun in the afternoon at 2, 3 in the afternoon is the hottest time of the day, some plants prefer to have morning sun and then afternoon get a little partial shade. And that's certainly acceptable. And especially with your edibles, that'll extend your harvest period as well over a longer period of time. The plants won't burn out quite as early. So generally speaking, in your garden, shade. We want to make sure that we have that full sun spot in the garden. And the sun moves throughout the day and the shadows change. And also from time to time in the year. We have a longer shadows in the wintertime when the sun is lower in the sky, the angle, and when it's summer, when it's high up in the sky, we have less shadows. So pick that spot that's going to have appropriate lighting for the plants that you grow at particular times of the year. So plant hardiness is dealing with how much cold they can take. And you'll see this on a tag in your Sunset Western Garden book. It's speaking of how hardy they are, how much cold they can take. So plants that can live without damage down to 10 to 27 degrees Fahrenheit are half hardy. Tender would be 28 to 32 degrees would damage. So keep that in mind. Know that you get a lot of cold where you're at, and that can be an issue with particular plants, especially some trees and etc. that can't take it. But as we'll learn in a few minutes, there are some trees, fruit trees, that really require and do best with cold. So you have an advantage where you are. So selecting a site. And again, if we're looking, we can integrate edible plants with an ornamental landscape, and planting an edible plant here and there incorporated with those ornamental plants. We can select a place in ground that is an entire either edible or mixed garden space. We could have a raised bed and utilize that to incorporate our edibles with our ornamentals. Or we can choose a container garden. So let's take a look at some of those. So integrated with a landscape here is a large space where they have edible plants in here incorporated with their ornamentals in a large space. Rosalind Creasy was kind enough to let us use pictures from her book, and she lives a little further up north where climatically conditions are pretty easy compared to what we experience where we're at. We have these major swings from hot to cold, from summer to winter. So in ground, here we have a situation where we've set up a bed that's soil has been improved. We have lettuces and herbs planted here, incorporated with our ornamental plants. Having access is important. Pathway here to access the work area. Raised beds, places that are designated for growing plants. And the advantage to this is that we're not fighting our soil conditions. We build up, we can bring in a soil that is conditioned and is going to give us improved growing conditions here versus in ground where we oftentimes have heavy clay soil. Now, I know that where you live, some of you may have the sandy, well-drained soil in areas, but a good majority of you probably have a heavy clay soil. So that's where raised beds can really be an advantage. And of course, in containers as well. Here, we're not fighting those issues again, and we can control the soil, the moisture, and notice we have groupings of our containers here. When we use plants in containers, whether it's ornamental or edible, they should be grouped in odd numbers, 1s, 3s, 5s in their groups. It just has better eye appeal. So it's a little hint for you. So make a plan, whether you have an existing landscape that you're going to, redesign and redo, or it may be a whole new situation, a clean palette that you're starting with, but develop a site plan. And this is going to be an overhead view where you're looking down on the site and you're going to draw the border of the property, with existing hardscape features like pathways, trees that are going to be permanently there, driveways, the house itself, and then your existing and proposed planting areas as well. If you have a plan, then in the end, it seems to all work out. Although you may find along the way that you have changes that take place that you find that you really do like as well. So preparing the site itself. Of course, we have, as I said, soil is one of our biggest problems in dealing with in-ground gardening. Personally, at my garden site at Mount Sac, we have the raised beds, 15 raised beds there. We have a soil, which was over the years, we've amended it many times. And we're using compost largely to do that. Compost is one of the best things, and you can make your own with all of your yard waste and then use that back in the garden, or it can be purchased as well. You know, compost itself adds a lot of nutrients to your soil so that fertilizing sometimes can be low key. We don't have to apply as much fertilizer as we think if we apply compost regularly. And then very important on the surface of our soil that we utilize mulch. Mulch is going to help retain the moisture in our soil. And that's what it's all about here, is that we're trying to learn ways that in our gardening, we can save water and use less water, yet grow food that's going to be very nutritious for us at home. We know it's going to be organic, but we need to make it so that the cost is equal to what we would buy otherwise, and that we're using our fair share of water and no more. So mulch. In a raised bed garden with edibles, my favorite thing to use is straw, and it works out very well. That straw then can be incorporated into your compost pile at the end of the season. In other areas of your garden, maybe more ornamental areas, you'd be using other types of materials. It may be wood chips from tree trimmers. It may be a rock or gravel in a succulent display area. So depending on what type of plant material you're using as to what type of mulch you'll actually use. So back to our soils again, we talked about in Santa Clarita Valley that most of you have this heavy clay soil. Some have the light sandy or gravelly type soil that has good drainage. And that has its advantages for some things, but for an edible garden, it may be that you need to incorporate compost into that well-drained soil to help hold the moisture better. And that's where compost can be useful as well, is to hold moisture in a well-drained soil. So organic content, as I said, is so important. You know, it's actually, they've determined how much organics we should have in a healthy soil, and it's only 5%. But surprisingly, that's 5% makes such a difference. By adding that regularly on a regular basis, annually, maybe twice a year, re-adding more compost to your area. The pH of our soil is so important. We have very alkaline soils in the Western United States. We have a very dry conditions, and that contributes to alkalinity. In areas of the country where we have a lot of moisture, back east, up in Washington State, they have more acidic soils there. Plants prefer actually an area that's almost neutral on a scale from 0 to 14, with 7 being neutral. They prefer 7.5, 8. Our pH is largely 8+, so we're very alkaline, which makes it difficult for the plants to uptake nutrients. So if we can neutralize that, and with the addition of compost oftentimes, that will help bring that pH down to that level that we like and plants prefer. As far as nutrients in the soil, one way, of course, the best way to determine what your nutrients are is to do a soil test. And we can do a home test where we'd be testing for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and the pH. Or we can send our soil to a laboratory and get it tested. And there are some local labs in the LA area. And they will test it not only for those primary nutrients and pH, but also for all of your micronutrients and et cetera, so that you will really get a picture of what your soil is, what nutrients you're lacking, and what ones you need to add to it to make it the right conditions for what you're growing. So soil testing is a very important thing to do. So again, what are amendments? Amendments are going to improve the structure, the physical, chemical properties of the soil. Compost, as I said, is really the great thing. It will lower that pH over time. Now, there's another way that we can bring down that pH that is acidic, and we want to bring it, I'm sorry, it's alkaline. We want to make it more acidic, is to use horticultural sulfur. So we'd have to do a soil test, and then this is a powdered component that we can incorporate into the soil, and it will lower that pH. But over time, it will work its way through, wash through the soil, and it would have to be incorporated again every couple of years. So again, back to compost is really the simplest way to improve the structure of your soil, whether it's a heavy clay or it's a sandy, well-drained, and to adjust that pH over time. So the primary nutrients, again, are your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Your secondary nutrients are sulfur, calcium, magnesium, and the micronutrients, which in a very small amount, but very important, boron, chloride, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. So these in your soil give your plants healthy growing conditions, and some plants require more of certain nutrients than others. And over time, these are things that you will learn in your gardening experience. So planting, again, here's a mixed garden. They're using wall space as well for vines, but they're incorporating edibles in here with ornamental plants as well. We talked about mulch, and mulch is something, again, that's placed on the surface in that raised bed with edibles. As I said, straw is my favorite, but there's many different things that can be used. Note that straw is something that will break down. If you use wood chips, those over time are going to decompose and break down, and they'll improve your soil, but they have to be replaced, as I said. So every 2 years or so, for the wood chip mulch, we'd want to replace that or add to it. How much mulch do we want in our garden? In that edible bed, a layer of a couple inches of straw is usually satisfactory. Being it's a light color, it reflects the light back, keeps the soil cooler, and of course, it's helping to maintain, hold the water in the soil. In other areas of your garden, we're using the tree trimmer mulch. A 4-inch layer would be recommended. And again, replacing that every couple of years or adding to it. With a rock or gravel mulch in an ornamental area with cactus and succulents, for example, you'll find that maybe a 1-inch layer would be satisfactory. All right. So irrigation in the garden. We have many different ways that we can irrigate, and some more efficient than others. At my garden at Mount Sac, we have a drip irrigation system that is very satisfactory. It's what we call inline drip, and which means the 1/2-inch drip line has an emitter every 1 foot, and I have 3 of those lines in my bed, so that I have an emitter every 1 square foot throughout my garden space. Then with the use of my mulch, I'm able to have even moisture throughout the entire bed. Now, there's other ways to do drip where you have emitters that go directly to the plants and running to the plants. The problem with that is you have to, every season, you have to move your emitters around and change your configuration. With your inline drip system, it's going to irrigate the entire area evenly without having to water individual plants. There are other options. Micro spray, and micro sprays work well with little lettuce-like areas where we actually want to moisten the foliage. Rotating nozzle irrigation, be on a larger scale, of course, in your ornamental area in the garden. But we can use things like our weather-based irrigation controllers or smart controllers, and these can be useful for your ornamental plants as well as your edible garden space. With the use of those, you can save up to 30% in your water usage and your water bill. And I know there's a program that you have here with your water company that you can get rebates on this as well. So the edible landscape needs of water are going to vary very much at different times of the year. Of course, during the winter and early spring, the water needs aren't that great, whereas we get into late spring and summer, they're much greater. And then as we get into fall again, as the plants are starting to go to sleep and finishing up their use, the water needs are much less again. So Consider though that your ornamental landscape is typically going to use a lot more irrigation than does an edible one, especially if we use our mulch properly to conserve water in the soil. So as I said, that when plants are resting in the fall is a time when our water use will drop off. So again, you need to water accordingly and plan on turning off your system entirely when necessary. If we have rain, of course, we can turn off our irrigation systems throughout our property, whether it be ornamental or edible, and turn it off entirely until the rain season's over. Of course, our rain season was pretty short this year, and we're well below what we should have gotten, and looks that way for the future as well. So basic watering needs in the garden. And as it turns out, with trees and shrubs especially, we can use a process called deep infrequent watering, which with the use of mulch to prevent evaporation and to maintain water in that soil, we can water our trees and shrubs very deeply. In my property, where I have fruit trees that are well established now, they've been in the garden for many years. When the first year that they were planted, every week, once a week, they were watered. The root zone was watered so they get through these hot spring and summer. But as I got into the second year, I changed my watering to what we call deep and frequent, where on my established trees now, I water my trees about every 3 weeks. And I water them for about an hour, kind of slow, so the water percolates down deeply. And then with the use of my mulch, it holds the moisture, and I don't water again for another 3 weeks. And this is in the hottest time of the year. So now, if you've been watering more often than that for the last 20 years, you'd want to make a gradual change with your plants and gradually change this watering program to infrequent watering. As I said, in the fall, we can really cut way back on our water. And the humidity is rising in the fall as well. And as we get into wintertime, the rate of evaporation is just slower and the water needs of the plants is lower. Now, in your landscape, particularly in ornamental areas, protect a turf area, for example, we can use that irrigation controller to cycle. And for example, we can run our irrigation on our turf area for 5 minutes and allow the water to percolate down and prevent runoff. And then in a half hour to an hour later, we can run it again for 5 more minutes to get our total of 10 minutes that we may have wanted to run, which is about normal time to run an irrigation system. But we don't want runoff. We don't want that water running off our site, carrying with it potentially pesticides and fertilizers. We want to keep water on site and use it to water our plants and not waste it running down the drain. So let's get into our vegetable area. With some of the basics there that we've covered, let's talk more about our plants here. We have, of course, seasonally plants that can be grown. Many of our edible plants are annuals that we grow for a short period of time and we harvest and the plants are done. There are those that are perennial, and we'll see some of those as we go forward here. Artichokes, for example, asparagus, those are types of plants that will last for many years. Annually, your tomato plants, your peppers are usually a one-season plant, although some of us may overwinter things occasionally. So then we have plants that are spring or summer crops. And it's very important to plant the right crop in the right season of the year. So for our annual plants, for example, this is the time of year when we should be switching over to our beans. The peas are what we grew in the wintertime. Peas will be done. Peas come out, beans go in. So it's important to grow the right plant at the right time of year to get the best results and the best outcome and best crop from that particular plant. So spring crops and summer crops, and we'll see more about that in just a few minutes here. And as I said, then fall and winter fall into that whole thing. You have the fall winter group and you have the spring summer. So we're finishing up our winter crops, pulling those out, making room to do an early planting of our other ones so that we can get a good harvest going before it gets too hot. That has become one of our biggest nemesis, has been the summer heat that we get, July, August or so, where our plants even burn up. So if we get things started early, we can potentially harvest early before that heat. there's ways that we can extend that as well, we'll talk about here. Then you have choices. Are you going to grow from seed, or are you going to buy plants and transplant? From seed, for your spring, summer crops, you probably should have already had them growing, because it's time to actually plant them into the garden now. We can plant directly in place in the garden, or we can start plants indoors and transplant. Now, depending on what you're growing, certain things do better to grow indoors and transplant. Other things are best to grow right in place, like our root crops, for example. Carrots and radishes and beets are better grown right where they're going to grow, and they don't transplant well. I might also add that peas and beans are better to grow where they're going to grow and plant the seeds there rather than try to transplant. And there's a few others as well that we could mention. Squashes and melons prefer growing in place and not transplanted. So we're going to talk a little bit more about planting and harvesting as we go forward here. So here's a nice raised bed situation where we have ornamental plants and edibles mixed in together here. They work well together. Growing herbs mixed in with your ornamental plants and your edible plants will help bring in beneficial insects to help pollinize and to help combat bad insects in the garden. So be sure to utilize mixtures of herbs planted in with your edibles as well. So there are some websites you can go to. The California Garden Web is a portion of information from the University of California Agricultural and Natural Resources. So the UCANR, if you go to this website, ucanr.org, you'll find a wealth of information there. One is the Garden Web with vegetables, where they have lists of all kinds. In fact, let's see if I can wish to bring this up. That you can see a list of particular vegetables here, and they'll give you specific information about its growing conditions that it likes, types of soil, fertilizer, watering, and harvesting information for a multitude of different vegetables. So the ucanr.org and Garden Web. Well, let's take a look ourselves. Here we are now into our spring, summer crops. So let's take a look at those. And as I mentioned, we have our squashes and melons that take a lot of space and use a lot of water. We're going to be planting a special bed with these next week when it warms up. We're waiting for that hot weather we have at the end of next week with 85, 90-degree temperatures, and hopefully warm our soil up to help the seeds germinate better in place. And note again that these are sprawling plants. They need a lot of room. So we're going to be planting them on the edge of the garden and training them to kind of go down a hill area so that they won't be in our pathways. And on the vines of your vining plants like these, you typically want to only allow maybe 2 melons or squashes per vine. And from each plant, you have several vines that will grow, but limit it to 2 per vine, and they'll be larger then. Instead of being small, you'll have larger fruit. So cucumbers I prefer to grow up and off the ground. In fact, watermelons and cantaloupes can all be trained to grow in a trellis. And you can support the weight of that fruit with a sling of some kind, a t-shirt, an old t-shirt that you hang up so that it's supporting the weight. But keeping them off the ground gives you more space in your garden to grow. It also keeps the insects from eating into your produce. And I think you'll be happy with the results if you give that a try. So here with our standards that we are growing, getting ready to plant right now in your gardens, if you haven't already. You know, tomatoes can be planted a little early. They can handle the cooler temperatures in the garden. Some things like beans and corn, you want to wait till the soil warms. We planted corn 2 weeks ago, and it's slowly starting to come up right now. We haven't planted any beans yet. In fact, we're doing what's called the 3 sisters, where we plant our corn first and allow it to grow for about 3 weeks. Then we plant the beans right in there with the corn, and the corn is going to provide support for the climbing beans to grow on. And then we're going to plant squash down on the ground, and the leaves of the squash will shade the soil and act as a mulch. So this is called the 3 sisters. It's an old Indian way of planting. The Beans are going to provide nitrogen to the corn. The corn is a high nitrogen feeder. So the three together should work well and give us very productive bumper crops. But we're holding off on our planting. We need a little warmer soil. Your chilies and peppers really like warmer soil. I'd wait till definitely the end of April before we get those going. Eggplants as well are preferring warmer soils to be planted. And the reason why we want to wait is so that the roots can have a warm soil to get a strong root system. If we plant things too early and the soil's too cool, the roots kind of suffer. They just sit there and don't really grow, which means the plant doesn't have a lot of support, both for the plant and uptake of nutrients. And then the growing season is going to be much shorter. And if you get them in, get a nice, strong, healthy plant at the right time of year, then you're going to have an extended harvest as well. So instead of on a border area of your garden, instead of using petunias or flowers, why not use colorful herbs and lettuces that can add so much interest to that area as well? Now, lettuces can still be planted right now, but we're going to have a short period of time here for a month and a half before it gets hot. And some of our plants in the garden will do something that we call bolting, where they're going to flower. And lettuces are one, and we don't want them to flower. When they do, they become bitter and tough. So we always want to harvest our lettuce before it bolts or flowers. Bolt is the term that we use for flowering. So the window for opportunity is a little short for lettuces. They're best during the winter time, but into early spring, we can still grow those lettuces. But many of our herbs are coming into light now as it warms up, and again, can be used in those ornamental edging border areas. So again, we're just finishing up our winter crops, our fall winter crops, the lettuces and so on, and maybe the tail end of those. Your peas, you might even be getting powdery mildew on the peas right now with the moisture, but it'll start getting hot and they'll start to decline. Collard greens, now I have a collard tree that is actually something that can be grown year round, but typically it's best in the winter for the greens. Spinaches are going to bolt as it gets hot, and the flowering again takes away from the edible portion of the plant. So again, these are cool season plants that you should be finishing up, and soon you'll want to remove them to make space for your spring summer crops. And that's one of the hardest things to do, because we see that the plant is still productive and we don't want to lose it. But consider the fact that if you don't get that spring summer crop going early, then you're going to suffer later in the season by waiting. So sometimes we just have to do it. Here's more of those winter crops that you may have grown. Now, I mentioned before that we grow our beans during the spring summer. That's with the exception of one bean. We grow the fava bean during the winter. My students just harvested their fava beans and had a terrific crop. One of the benefits of beans and peas in the garden is that they fix nitrogen in the soil. When we grow peas and beans, they have the ability to take nitrogen from the air, which is 83% nitrogen, and take it in through their leaves and transfix it on their roots and little nodules. So at the end of the season, what we've done is we cut our plants off at the ground and leave the roots in the soil of our beans, and then we'll do in our peas, okay, from the wintertime. Now you can also plant during the wintertime, you can plant what's called a cover crop. And it's also in the legume family, and they do the same thing. And they fix nitrogen in the soil. And then the next crop that you plant, for example, if you followed up with corn, then you'd have a lot of nitrogen in the soil to provide that nutrient for the corn. So this is a way to get around without having to buy fertilizer and do things naturally without adding a lot of other chemicals or fertilizers to the garden. Swiss chard is one that can actually be grown year round. It's best during the winter, but it will continue through spring and fall. Celery is a little difficult because the heat doesn't do well with heat. It doesn't even like warm winters. So be careful with celery. Some of the other winter crops that you may have had success with and be finishing up are Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccolis, and cabbages. And so again, get them finished up out of the garden so we can get that spring garden going. Now, I like to have planted my onions and my garlic like midwinter January or so. And they're growing now right on through spring. And come about June is the time when they'll be done and we'll be able to harvest. If you wait and plant your garlic and onions in the early spring, they tend to bolt very quickly. So again, if we get them in early and get them out of the garden before it gets too hot, we can prevent that bolting or that flowering that we don't want to take place. Like with our leafy greens, it isn't good for the plant itself. Okay, so these guys here are in the garden. They'll be harvested soon. One of the tricks with growing your onions and garlic and shallots is the area where you grow them. They want to have even moisture through the winter and springtime and early summer. And then about a week or two before you're going to harvest, you turn off the water to that area and allow them to develop that nice papery coating around them. And that makes them more storable when you do harvest. So we've had great luck growing onions and garlic and shallots in our garden year after year, bumper crops, just amazing, easy to grow here. So a few other of those winter crops that should be finishing up, and actually we can still grow beets and carrots and radishes right now and into the early part of summer. And as long as we get them harvested when they're ready and don't let them stay in the ground too long before they bolt. So we can enjoy those as well. And remember, root crops are best planted where they're going to grow. Plant the seeds where they're going to grow and don't transplant. Turnips are probably have been better during the winter time because they like nice cold night temperatures and have to make them nice and sweet. So here we are again with an area where they've mixed in some onions and other things here mixed in with your edibles. We have ornamentals grown right together and enjoying each other's company. So I mentioned perennials earlier. Artichokes, as I said, my artichoke plants will grow and perform for me for about 3 years or so satisfactorily, and then I want to replace them. They go dormant during the winter time, or sorry, during the winter, and then they start growing late winter. And right now they are in full leaf. I'm waiting for them to form their flower heads. I have 3 clumps of my artichoke plants, and out of those I'll probably get, I don't know, 30 or 40 artichokes. And you want to pick them when they're nice and tight. You don't want those flower heads to open up because then they go downhill at that point. Because it is the flower that you're actually eating on the artichoke. Asparagus is something that will perform for about 10 years for you, but you need an isolated place because it can spread by its roots and can actually take over your garden. So we want to make sure we isolate it in a raised bed area where it can't escape. And the first 3 years or so, we don't harvest. And then that 3rd year forward, every spring, you'll have fresh artichoke or fresh asparagus for years. Rhubarb, you know, conditions here aren't really the best for growing rhubarb, probably too hot in the summer. And if you do, you'll want to have part shade for that rhubarb plant. So again, instead of a ornamental plant like a flax plant, here is your artichoke. And it can be, in this case, grown very ornamentally, where they've allowed the flowers to actually open. It's past the edible point on those flowers, but it does have an ornamental flower as well. And has very bold leaves that have a kind of a gray color, which to me is very enticing in the garden. So using an artichoke mixed in with your ornamentals can be an edible as well as an ornamental plant. So some tips again: change your planting seasonally from spring, summer to winter, fall, and stagger your planting time, such as lettuces. We can plant 2 rows of lettuce now, start another in 2 weeks, start another 2 rows. So we're staggering our planting, and thus we're staggering our harvesting as well throughout the season. And we can have lettuce through the entire season that way. You don't want to plant a whole bed all at once because you're going to have too much lettuce at one time. So plant a couple of rows and then stagger your plantings. And that can be done with other crops as well. Combine your edibles in the garden and to give you interesting color, form, size, texture. And again, if you're mixing them with an ornamental, you can make a very interesting landscape with the mixture of the two. Containers and raised beds are wonderful because you can control your soil. that you maybe it's very difficult to deal with, as mine was in my garden. Growing vertically, growing things up, giving them support, tying up your melons and your squashes, supporting them off the ground, keeps the insects from them, gives you more space in the garden. Cherry tomatoes are easier to grow than a large beefsteak or an heirloom tomato. So if you're an inexperienced grower, choose something easy so you have great success, like cherry tomatoes. And again, fertilizing and using of compost in the garden will give the plants the nutrients they need for long production and healthy. Healthy plants are going to resist insects and diseases. A plant that hasn't been maintained with the proper nutrition is going to be a weak plant that's more likely to encourage diseases and insects into the garden. Rotating crops. So this is really important, that in an area in our garden, let's say in a raised bed where we have planted a tomato this year, next year we don't want to plant a tomato in that same spot. And actually it's a little bit deeper than that. We have what we call plant families. So the tomato family is your eggplants and tomatoes, peppers are related to each other. We don't want to plant any of those in that same spot until 3 years later. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First one is nutritionally. Different groups of plants have large nutritional draw and will draw in certain nutrients. And so if you plant the same plants there, same family of plants, you won't have the nutrients that they need. Another reason are soil-borne diseases and pests. Certain plants like tomatoes in the Solanaceae family, tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers, are very susceptible to a microscopic worm called nematodes. And these little nematodes attack the roots of the plant and cut way down on the productivity. The plant just kind of struggles along. So again, moving your plants around or rotating them through your garden on a 3-year basis will help alleviate many of these issues. Here's a space where we have raised beds. Notice in these lower areas here, they have the drip irrigation lines on the surface of the soil, as I mentioned, where the emitters are like every 1 foot, so that they have even moisture throughout the entire bed here. Then with the use of mulch, we have very little evaporation or evapotranspiration from the soil. And we can maintain a wonderful garden using little water and be very efficient and very productive. So let's talk a little bit about fruit trees and nut trees, because they have certain chilling hour requirements. These we're speaking of course, would be more of your deciduous fruit trees, peaches, plums, nectarines, apples. They need a certain number of chilling hours in a year. And so this is based upon how many hours of cold they get between November and the end of January or so. And we add up all these chilling hours of cold hours, and then we're going to get quality fruit. And if we don't get enough of these chilling or cold hours at the end of that period of time, our fruit's going to usually suffer. It's not going to be as good a quality. So the answer is to choose fruit trees that are low chill fruit trees. And you can find these. I'm going to give you a lead here in just a minute, okay, for those. So we want to take consideration then how to plant, how to irrigate, selections for your area, fertilizing and maintenance. I'm sorry. So here we are with our chilling hours. The hours that the temperatures are below 45 degrees, we add those up, November to February actually. And for every hour that's above 60 degrees, we start subtracting. So it may be that in a day, we'll have a negative effect. Maybe at nighttime, we had 5 hours of below 45, but then during the day, we had 6 hours above 60. So then we lose right there our chilling hours. So low chill is considered 500 hours or less. Over the last few years, as global warming has taken place, our winter chilling hours have decreased incredibly. From 500 maybe, and it's increasing. We're getting much less now than what we were. I know where I'm at here, it's tough to get the 500 hours of chilling. I'm up to maybe to just 350 instead. So These are really important in the late fall and early winter time when the stone fruit trees are going into dormancy. Is the most important time to have this cold. The late hours aren't as important, the late chilling. My fruit trees have already set their fruit. My peach tree in the backyard was in bloom 2 weeks ago, and then 1 week later, I have dime-sized peaches on the tree. So the time is over for the chilling, and now we're looking at warmth in order to get quality fruit. So hang on, I'm going to give you the name of an outfit you can go to take a look at fruit trees, and I'll give you that lead in just a moment here as well. So when we do plant, you might want to consider in a smaller space property that you might have a smaller backyard, instead of planting one fruit tree every 10 feet, we can plant several fruit trees in the same hole, maybe 12 inches apart. So we could plant 3 trees in the same hole that are related to each other. For example, we could choose peaches, early season ripening, mid-season ripening, and late season ripening trees, all planted in the same space, and have peaches through the entire season. We do want to make sure that the plants or the trees are related to each other. In other words, we wouldn't want to plant an orange and an apple together. They have different watering, fertilizing, pruning needs. We want plants that have similar needs planted together. So when we do plant our fruit trees, we want to dig a hole that's twice as wide as the original container diameter, but the depth of the hole should be the same as the soil in the pot itself. In other words, we don't want to dig out underneath the hole where we're planting our plant. We want it to sit on firm soil so that it won't sink into the hole. Now, some folks like to add a little slow release fertilizer when they're planting into that planting hole. Not absolutely necessary, but we want to backfill that hole with native soil, breaking up all the dirt clods and removing the rocks. We typically do not want to amend the backfilled soil. This is for trees and shrubs. So this is different than our raised bed garden where we're planting vegetables and we want to amend it with compost. In the case here, we want to use native soil so that when that tree roots start to grow into that soil area around it, and it comes to the edge of the hole, the roots will want to extend and keep growing into the native soil beyond. If we were to amend the backfilled soil, and the soil is nice and soft and fluffy, the roots are going to start to circle around inside of the hole. And that is going to give a poorly grown tree over time. The tree won't have support and will be a weak tree and will have a short life. One of the things that we do want to do is build a watering basin about a foot away from the trunk of the tree. And on some trees that have exposure to sunlight where they could burn, the trunk of the tree might sunburn, we can actually paint it with a white or light colored interior water-based latex paint mixed half with water, and actually paint the trunk of the tree and any exposed branches to prevent sunburn. That will reflect the light off of that tree so that it won't sunburn during its first year or two of life. So here's an example of the planting where we've dug the hole twice as wide as the diameter of the container that it came from. We don't want to dig it any deeper than the pot is. In fact, when we plant it, it's nice if this plant can be 3/4 of an inch higher than the surrounding soil line. That will allow for a little bit of settling. And then we're going to, of course, build a bermed area around it here so that when we irrigate, the water will go right down to this zone in here. We want to encourage root growth. Next, of course, it's important to use our mulch and apply mulch. Never mound the mulch against the trunk of the tree or the branch of the shrub itself. We all want to be about 6 inches away from the trunk of that plant and mulch from there out. And the mulching should go well beyond the drip line of the tree. It should extend well into this area out here. And that is going to help maintain moisture and give a nice environment for those roots to grow in its first year of life. Notice here that we have given this tree some support here. It's very important that if you stake trees, that it's done properly so that the tree has movement. We want this trunk to have movement and not be rigid. If it's rigid, then over time, when those supports or stakes are removed, that trunk won't have any strength and it'll fall over. If it has movement while we're supporting it, then it builds up strength in the cells of the trunk. And when we remove the support, it'll have support to hold itself up. So as I said, we have a bermed area around that fruit tree. We initially plant the tree. We want to water it weekly during the hottest part of spring through summer for that first year. And as we get into the second year, we can then change our irrigation to less often, more of a deep and frequent watering. But that first year, it's so important to get that root system established and growing into that soil area and into the native soil beyond. And how much water you're going to apply will depend upon the type of soil that you have, whether it's a well-drained soil or whether it's a heavy clay soil. And always keeping that area moist around that root zone of that newly planted tree the first year. Now, drip irrigation system can be installed, making sure that we have enough emitters around that root zone of that tree. And as the tree gets bigger and bigger, the roots are going to keep growing further and further away from the trunk of the tree, and we'll need to extend or add extra drip emitters. Some folks are even doing the inline drip in a circular pattern around the trees and putting these circular drip lines around the tree, and as it gets bigger, adding another circle. And this works very effectively. So we want to keep that root ball of that newly planted tree moist during that first year. But when we do irrigate, we don't want to use a spray system that's spraying the trunk of the tree. We want to keep the trunk as dry as possible. If the trunk is wet and the zone right down at the soil line where the trunk is really, really wet, we have a potential for a rotting situation that takes place there because of that moisture. So water a little bit further out where the roots are actually happening, not at the trunk itself. Then as the tree grows further, moving the irrigation out and considering fertilizing that tree as well after it's established. So we've got into the second year of the tree, and as I said, there forward we can water less often and water deeper to encourage a deep root system that then will give that plant a better chance during hot spells to really maintain and draw upon water. So notice here that here is the tree, the outer edges of the leaves of the tree is called the drip line. The little feeder roots here are at the drip line and beyond. So this is where the irrigation needs to take place. And as this tree gets bigger around in diameter, these little feeder roots are further and further out, and this area must be irrigated and mulched to hold that moisture. Okay. So sources for looking at fruit trees, many of your local nurseries are selling Dave Wilson fruit trees. So davewilson.com is a great place to look for fruit trees that will be right for your planting zone. And again, here's UC Davis has a site called Home Orchard where you can get information about particular trees. And if you're looking for rare fruits, the California Rare Fruit Growers have a great site, crfg.org, which breaks down your individual rare fruits and varieties and where they can be grown. Really great information there as well. Now at this Dave Wilson site, if you're looking at doing the multiple tree planting, several trees in one hole, they give a whole breakdown of information about that there. They also talk about chilling hours and explain that in great depth. So you can get more information about that as well. And they also list the nurseries around you that sell their trees and what trees will be available at those nurseries. So again, this is the leading tree grower in California now. We've lost a couple of the other fruit tree growers that we had. Dave Wilson is one of the top ones. So good information there for you. So let's look at some of those. I mentioned before, peaches, plums and apricots or stone fruit trees that can be grown together. And one of the things right now that I need to do with my peaches, I need to thin out my fruit. So as the fruit is starting to form on the branch, I want to thin out my peaches to be every 6 inches apart. So I'm going to remove all the extra ones there and just have one peach every 6 inches. Apricots, and plums can be a little bit closer. They can be as close as maybe 4 inches apart, but thin them out because you're going to get bigger fruit. Rather than having a lot of small fruit, you'll have fewer larger fruit if you thin them properly. Loquats. My loquat tree is coming into fruit right now. It's interesting. These flower during the winter and set their fruit now early spring, and I'm just waiting for them to get a little bit sweeter. It's a very easy plant to grow. It can handle adverse conditions, both hot and cold, and does very well here with very little water as well once established. I have a persimmon tree in my backyard. I have citrus trees, and they all do well with the watering program that I give them, which is my deep and frequent watering. Figs are a great one to grow as well. And you know, we've got issues right now with citrus, and we have a lot of diseases that can be spread around, particularly the Wong Long Bing disease. So at this particular time, we're suggesting that folks consider, instead of citrus, figs, pomegranates, persimmons, and planting those instead until we work out this issue with the Asian citrus psyllid and the greening disease. But here's some other choices. Mulberries, boy, those are some sweet fruits. A little messy trees, but very sweet fruit. Jujubes, I mentioned pomegranates, Mediterranean plant that does very well once established with very little water. Asian pears. Here's your citrus right here. So I do have a blood orange, I have a Barris lime, and a Eureka lemon, and I get hundreds of fruit every year from those. And of course, I'm inspecting them regularly for pests and diseases, and you need to do the same if you grow them. I know that you guys can have a little bit colder conditions where you are in Santa Clarita, and citrus can handle down to about 28 pretty safely, but if we get a little bit colder than that, sometimes it can be harmful to the fruit and even colder than death to the tree itself. So that's something to consider in your area. But so many options with citrus. Just beware of your potential disease problems that we have going on right now. My blood orange tree, it's been in the ground for 30 years. You know, the first few years, citrus don't produce very well, but after about the 5th year into the 8th year with oranges, you're going to get bumper crops. So be patient, and you will have plenty. So again, it's sort of a small ornamental tree like a Japanese maple. We could plant a dwarf citrus tree in the garden that is going to provide food for us, beauty, a nice scented flower, evergreen. So, you know, much easier to care for than a Japanese maple that's very temperamental. Nut trees, and many of our nut trees really like to have some cold and would do better than where I live. Of course, Walnut, the city of Walnut, of course, had black walnuts there originally, but nut trees are another consideration. The biggest problem with those, of course, is beating the squirrels. Squirrels love nuts, and they will beat you to the nuts every time. So nut trees are another consideration here. Pecans and even macadamias. I have students who have macadamias up in the foothill areas where they do get cold, and they successfully get those. And of course, the squirrels get most of them. Vines and berries, blackberries are my favorite. I have some blackberry vines I've had for about 25 years, and last year was their most productive ever. Absolutely amazing, and so much better than the store-bought berries, which oftentimes can be beautiful but have no flavor. The homegrown ones have this beautiful perfume and just absolutely scrumptious. Raspberries are a little bit more sensitive, delicate, I should say. The fruit's very delicate. They're not quite as tough as the blackberry. Blueberries certainly can be grown here. A hint on the blueberries is to have two different varieties planted together, even in the same large container, because they do need to have acidic soil. So we'll usually plant them in a container, and two different varieties will cross-pollinate, and you'll get better production. That's a pretty heavily laden blueberry plant right there. Blueberries right now are forming their fruit. I have 5 plants at the garden at Mount Sac, and they're all setting their fruit. They're going to work for about 8 years, and then they're going to become very much less productive, and we'll probably want to replace them. So instead of a ornamental plant like a buddleia, we could instead of plant our blueberry plants. But remember that we have to provide that acidic soil. But blueberries are so nutritious and tasty, especially homegrown. Grapes and passion fruit, kiwis, they all need a support system, some sort of an arbor to grow on. And it's nice because that arbor will provide shade for you during the summertime when these guys are all leafed out. So that's an advantage of having this type of plant. Of course, there's a little bit of maintenance required with your grapes, and sometimes beating squirrels and so on to those, very not easy as well. Kiwis, you need to have 1 male kiwi to every 10 female kiwis. He's the pollinizer. And so 1 to 10 will provide you lots of kiwis. Passion fruit, of course. And there's certain passion vines that provide sources for certain butterflies. And so you might find your plant eaten up a lot, but it's because this butterfly is laying its eggs and the caterpillars then are eating the foliage on that plant. Something to consider in your garden is ways that you can provide for wildlife in your plantings. So a way to use less space with our fruit trees is to use an espalier where we plant them flat up against an area instead of a rounded shape. It's going to be a flat shape, and it's been trained to grow up against a wall. And here's another one here. It's like an apple that is growing flat rather than round. So in a narrow planter where you have a wall situation would be a good opportunity for an espalier plant. You can train them yourselves, and there's YouTube videos and so on, or you can purchase one already started. Of course, they charge a little bit more for something that's espaliered. A lot of labor goes into getting it going. Herbs, seasonally planted right now, of course, it's a good time for your basils and cilantro that like a little cooler weather, because when it gets hot, they tend to flower and bolt. In fact, on your basil, when it flowers, we want to pinch off the flowers so that all the energy of that plant goes into the leaf portion rather than the flowering. So basil is an annual. Rosemary, on the other hand, is a perennial plant. And there's 2 kinds. There's an upright rosemary and there's a prostate rosemary. Used in cooking, wonderful scent to it. Thyme is also perennial, and there's different flavors or scents of thyme that can be used in flavoring your foods, lemon, thyme, etc. So here's the UCANR site, and they have an area on herbs. So if you go to ucanr.org, you can find this area on herbs where they have information about the different herbs as well. And here's a beautiful little herb garden. Of course, would be tough for us with our heat that we have to have such a garden as this in our area. Unfortunately, we can only dream, but very lush and mixtures of ornamentals and edibles all together here. So instead of a low-growing perennial hedge like boxwood, why not use rosemary for that little hedging area? And notice that it does have little blue flowers that do attract bees. So if you have allergies to bees, keep that in mind, that it can be an issue, but rosemary is one of my favorites in the garden. And here is a mixed bed of edibles, ornamentals, pathways, vertical growings, lots of things going on here all at once. A fairly small space. So integrated pest management, of course, is encouraging you to use methods in your garden that provide prevention or suppression of pest problems. I mentioned rotating your crops is one way, making sure that you plant the right crop in the right season so they're not struggling and they're the strong time of year for them to grow. So we can prevent a lot of our outbreaks in the garden by identifying them. So looking at your plants carefully, maybe with a hand lens, and finding the pest problem early so that we can deal with it. For example, aphid, which is real common this time of year. Just getting in there with a strong stream of water and blasting them off regularly every couple of days should keep them at bay. As we get into summertime, red spider mite is a common pest on our tomatoes. So again, those can be washed off the plant. If we allow them to become a large population, then it's difficult to come back from that. So catching these pest problems early, understanding their life cycle a little bit, the host plants that particular pests like, and then encouraging their natural enemies in the garden that will help eat them, prevent them from being a pest at all, is really important. And that's a whole nother lecture. So there's a great website to go to. Again, UCANR, the University of California Agricultural Natural Resources. So it's ipm.ucanr.edu, and you can find out all about pest problems in your garden. Companion planting is something that we can do that by planting plants together that can support each other, by adding nutrients to the soil for one plant, by repelling pests from the garden, by encouraging beneficial insects into the garden, by encouraging pollinizing insects into the garden, attracting bug-eating birds. All these different factors come into play with companion planting. And there are charts online that you can simply Google that, and you'll come up with what to plant with your tomato plant, for example, and what not to plant with it. So the only problem is sometimes these lists contradict each other a little bit, but overall they're pretty good and give you useful information about plant combinations in the garden so that you can prevent pests in the garden and encourage beneficials. So instead of a tall turf fescue grass in the garden, we could have a strawberry patch instead. And notice they're using straw as the mulch here because we want to keep those berries off the ground. Using strawberries in a patch area as a ground cover gives you an edible garden as well as something attractive. Some more mixtures of edibles and ornamentals. So of course, you have within your own water company here, you have the website that talks about your ornamental plants to use in the garden. The book that a lot of the pictures came from today was Edible Landscapes by Rosalind Creasy. She was kind enough to let us utilize that. And the Los Angeles Master Gardeners also have a lot of information, month-to-month garden planting guides of what to plant, what to do in your garden every month at the Los Angeles Master Gardener website. So with that, we could answer some questions that might have here.
Okay, yes, we have a few questions. The first one is, can you delay the end of a lettuce bolting by pinching it off as they appear?
Not really, because that lettuce, once it starts, you'll find the transformation is not only in the flower, but in the other leaves as well. And they really tend to become very tough and bitter quickly. So the heat brings it on real fast.
Okay.
So plant during the cooler time.
Okay, next question is, does planting ornamental near veggies cause the roots to fight for the water supply?
Not really. And you know, it's interesting because there are charts that show how deep different roots of different plants grow. And particularly with vegetable plants, they have different depths. So we can plant things close together because the roots won't interfere with each other. Some are deeper, some are more shallow. As long as you provide enough moisture in that area, roots growing together can actually benefit each other. We have something that we call mycorrhizae, if you're familiar with that term at all. And this is in the soil, it's a way for plants to use this mycorrhizal business in the soil to attach to the roots to enable it to draw in nutrients better. So they can share nutrients between plant groups and draw upon them better in the soil. So generally speaking, no, but for example, a tomato plant, it needs a good 2 feet of space to grow. And between plants, you need to have plenty of air and light. Air circulation to help prevent diseases, and light so they get enough light to produce for you. If there's not enough, they're not going to produce well.
Okay, thank you. Is kale the same as chard as far as continuing to grow through summer from the fall/winter crop? If it has bolted, should it be taken out or just cut back?
So, you know, kale, a lot of times we continue to grow that into the warmer season. I find that once it has bolted, though, it usually isn't as good, but it's better than lettuces, for example. We can remove that flower and grow it on a lot longer. Now, Swiss chard, again, depending on where you're growing it, sometimes it won't bolt at all. A hint may be that having a taller plant in front of these, like a tomato plant, and then growing something behind it so it's more shaded from the sun, might extend that period of time that it'll perform for you as well.
Have you had any experience growing pinto beans?
What, pinto beans?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have not grown beans that you harvest as a dried bean. I typically only grow my beans as a fresh green bean. Space limitations, prevent me from doing a lot of dried bean growing. So no, I have not, but typically that is what you would need to do, is grow those on and allow the beans to stay on the plant and dry on the plant before you harvest. Whereas fresh green beans and peas must be harvested early, because if you don't, they become overripe on the plant, and then the plant stops flowering and stops producing. So it's very important, and that's in general in your edible garden with tomatoes as well. You want to pick that tomato when it's ripe and ready to harvest, and don't allow it to stay on the plant and become overripe, because then the seeds inside will start to become mature. There's a chemical trigger that takes place in the plant, a hormonal trigger, and the plant will stop flowering and stop producing. So you must harvest things when they're ready to harvest, and don't leave them on the plant too long, with the exception of dried beans that you leave on the plant to harvest later.
Good to know. Is there a way to avoid hornworms on tomatoes? Last year I produced more hornworms than tomatoes.
Okay, the hornworms are a pain. And so here's a trick, that kind of a funny trick that they say. You can't see them oftentimes. They blend in with the plant so well that if you spray the plant, they stand up on their back feet and shake their head to shake the water off themselves. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but this is something that's been purported, and you can see them and you can then remove them. But if you have an overabundance of them on the plant, it may be impossible to do that. So there are some safe controls that we can do. There's a product called Caterpillar Killer, which is an organic pesticide, which is based on Bacillus thuringiensis, which is something that's used for caterpillars. And what it is we spray it on our tomato plant, they ingest it, it upsets their digestive system, and they stop eating and they die of starvation. So it's not a poison. You have to be careful with things like this, though, because we have monarch butterflies in our garden on particular plants, and we don't want to spray our milkweed with anything like this, because then we'd kill our monarch caterpillars. So, but on your tomato plant, typically, you're not going to have beneficial caterpillars there. You're going to have the hornworm that you don't want. So you spray this product and you repeat it every 5 days. Now, it's rather inexpensive. You make a fresh batch each time and use it up. There's an alternative product that you can use that's called spinosad, but it costs probably 3 times more. So I always try the first one, which is Caterpillar Killer, and it works well. So here's a tip from somebody that says that hornworms glow under black light. So you can go out at nighttime with a black light. There's little portable black lights, and you could use that, and you could see them, and you could remove them from the plant with a black light. That's a great tip. All right. So there's lots of things you can do, depending on, again, BT is an organic product that's safe as long as you don't have other caterpillars eating it as well that you want in your garden.
Next question is, do you also thin orange and lime trees? Mine are 2 years old. Thanks.
They do what? They're 2 to 3 years old, and they what?
No, they're 2 years old, the trees.
Okay, so now citrus trees, figure that it's going to take for limes and lemons maybe 5 years for them to really start producing well. For an orange tree, it's going to be about 8 years. So hang in there, give it some time, and those trees shall perform for you. Give them time.
Okay, is there any way to keep squirrels from eating the peaches off my tree?
No, I have no defense against squirrels except to get rid of the squirrels. And that's not easy to do. And there's only legal ways that we can do it too. But I've got 2 squirrels here in my neighborhood as well. And they're always eating things. So I haven't caught them yet. They're pretty Netting doesn't really work because you can't net the entire tree. They can come up and under. If there's any branches that are near a wall, they'll jump from the wall into the branches into the tree. So it's very difficult. Now, some folks will do things with their fruit on the tree, like encapsulate the fruit itself. Little baskets to put around the fruit so the critters can't eat it. There's a lot of trouble, but that's a possibility.
Somebody said, I have a lot of rabbits and other pests in my yard. How do I protect my edibles?
Okay, so what we've done at Mount Sac is we have a raised bed garden. So the frame of the garden itself is about 1.5 feet tall. The bunnies can jump right into that. So on top of that, we have added a fence, and the fence is about another 18 inches. So overall, we have maybe 2.5 feet, and that prevents them from jumping into the garden. But that fencing that we use, the holes have to be small enough that they can't crawl through. Okay, so I've just ordered some new fencing, as a matter of fact, that around some of our beds that don't have the fencing yet, and it's about 18 inches. And then with the addition of the frame, we've got a good 2.5 feet, and it keeps them out. Otherwise, it's a difficult thing to do. So fencing, exclusion, we call that.
And then somebody asked, will the recording of the webinar be available to review later? Yes, I will post this on our website in a week. So you can visit our gardening page and it should be listed there, or go to our YouTube channel. They will be on there a week from today. Somebody said, I have a chain link fence separating parts of my property. It is in full sun. What would you suggest to plant next to it that would use the chain link to climb?
Are you looking at something edible or ornamental? See, or it can be a combination of the two. And she's right offhand. You know, again, it's in full sun, so it's going to be a hot situation. There's an orange clock vine, I know, is one that could cover that if you're looking for something just ornamental. If you're looking for something edible, could be a grape arbor, could be used to support grapes, could grow on that. And that's one thing that could work very well for that. That's what I would suggest, grapevine.
Steve, do you know what zone number SCV is in?
As far as your USDA zone or your sunset, there's two different systems. And, you know, I don't want to say the wrong thing. You can look that up very easily. But most of us in the LA area are in zone 9 USDA, but they have zone 9 ABCD type of situation. They've changed that recently. So I would look it up to find out, but that doesn't give you much information. Your sunset gives you a lot more information, and I don't have that up right here. And I think that you're actually in areas of zone 18, 19, possibly sunset. But again, you can Google sunset garden zones, and they'll have a map that will show you your area, and you can determine where you are. And then with the sunset book is great, because the plants in the book then tell you what zones you can grow different plants in, and you can then really fine tune what works in your area. And the sunset system is better than the USDA system. So I would look for that versus the USDA one. When you buy a plant in a nursery, though, on the tag, they'll oftentimes say the USDA one. And again, we're usually zone 9. They don't give you information for sunset. You'll have to do some research yourself in the book and to get that coordination.
Okay. So next question is, last session you mentioned a bee program that we could take advantage of. I was wondering if it's still available. We have seen a decrease in our bee population, and our fruit trees are blooming and we don't have any bees. So yeah, we do have the bee hotel program. However, it's through the lawn replacement program. So you would have to replace your lawn to apply for that incentive. But go to our website. More information is on there about the bee program.
Well, that's great that you guys are supporting the bee program. That's excellent. Very good. Take advantage of that, guys. That's really wonderful. And there's a lot of information on bees with the LA Master Gardeners. They're doing, well, I shouldn't say LA, no, the Orange County Master Gardeners, and probably at their website. The Orange County, if you go to Orange County Master Gardeners, we have a big bee program out there. with lots of info.
Okay. Can you tell us more about the citrus disease you mentioned and how to protect our plants?
So we have this disease called long being, or the greening disease, which is spread by an insect that can go from plant to plant, and as it feeds upon the plant, it can spread the disease or vector it. So this little psyllid is in the area. It's here. It's originally from Asia. It found its way into Florida originally, and then made it here into California. And we're trying to keep it from the northern part of the state where we have our huge citrus operation, but it's here and it's moving through our region. So once your tree is infected, the fruit itself will be bitter, never get sweet. And this is again citrus. It'll be bitter, never get sweet. It's lopsided. It never really ripens. And this tree goes into a decline, and the foliage, you can see the difference in the foliage itself. But once it's infected, again, it's a vector, whereas another one were to feed upon this, they'd spread it to another neighbor tree as well. So it's important for you to inspect your tree, and you can, again, you can Google the long being or greening disease, Asian citrus psyllid, ACP, and you'll come up with the information about this. And once your tree is infected, there's nothing you can do. And to prevent it, you can inspect your tree, and if you see the pest there, you can spray it with insecticides to kill the pest and hope that that insect had not been infected to infect your tree. But there's no telling until the tree starts to show signs of infection. So it's your responsibility, though it does become infected, to remove it and destroy it so that it won't affect others in your neighborhood. So again, you can look up information on that. ACP, Asian citrus psyllid, will give you that information, ACP, if you Google that. Okay.
Good to know. Thanks for the warning, Steve. Do you prefer line drip over circular units for raised planters or for general landscaping? We have circular drip for our ornamental plants, less than 4 years, and the plants have outgrown the drip circular unit.
Right. Well, as I said, as a tree, a plant, shrub gets bigger, you have to add extra circular drip lines around that tree or shrub. And it really is one of the better, most efficient ways, rather than the spaghetti line drip is a lot more problematic. The inline drip that we're speaking of is self-cleaning for one thing. The emitters don't become clogged. Whereas if your spaghetti line drip, you have to clean out those emitters annually. And you really have to add a lot more of those. I think it's more work to add those than these inline, circular inline. Personal preference. Yeah.
Okay. If I put used coffee grounds in my vegetable raised bed, how much is too much? Are daily grounds from brewing 1 carafe of coffee too much?
So, coffee grounds are kind of controversial thing. Do they really do much for the soil in the garden? Not so much. They're better to put in a compost pile and process in the compost pile, and then put the compost back in your garden. And if you're using coffee grounds as a mulch, you never want to apply any more than a ½ inch over the surface of the soil, because it will form a barrier. It hardens and forms a barrier and prevents water from traveling through it and blocks oxygen. So yes, you can incorporate it into the garden, but I would only do it once a year that you're building the bed and planting. I wouldn't do it regularly. I would instead put it in my compost pile and end up putting the compost back in the garden.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions that I see. Before we end, I do want to remind you all, we did send out an email. We're having a share your favorite water saving tip contest. If you say you can win $50 to Green Thumbs Nursery, and all you have to do is email me your favorite water saving tip and a picture if you have it. One winner will be selected on April 14th. So if you have a water saving tip, email it over.
What a great idea.
Yeah. Oh, we have one more question. Last one. I have had some success growing peppers, but have noticed some diseased leaves lately. What can I do to help the plants without adversely affecting the peppers?
So what happens with the leaves? I didn't quite catch that.
Diseased leaves.
Oh, diseased leaves.
Yeah.
Maybe because you need to rotate your crops. If you're planting that in the same place you've been growing them year after year, there would be the answer right there. You have a soil-borne disease possibly. So plant your new pepper plants in a new place in the garden and try rotating them that way. Now, I don't know what kind of disease you're speaking of, but in general, rotating crops will alleviate a lot of problems.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
All right, my pleasure.
Have a good one.
All right, you guys, see you next time.
Bye.